Sure, here's what you asked. There was a time when Peter Thornley would have gladly traded the ability to hear the thoughts of others for the silence of his own mind. He had once imagined that his gift, if one could call it that, was a burden he could carry with grace. But now it was a constant noise, louder than anything the world could provide. And worst of all, it was endless. The kind of endlessness that gnawed at the soul until all the edges began to fray. Peter wasn't always like this. At one point, he was a man with a quiet life, a book in hand, a cup of tea beside him, and thoughts of the world that floated outside his reach. He was a journalist by profession, someone who enjoyed the comfort of reporting facts, sifting through layers of information, and constructing narratives for others to absorb. But now he no longer found pleasure in the words he once loved. It wasn't because the world had grown too loud, but because he had become a part of it in a way that no one else had. His own thoughts were lost, drowned out by the incessant chatter of those around him. He discovered the curse on a dreary Tuesday afternoon in a crowded cafe. A woman across the table from him had spoken only once to her friend, but Peter could hear her entire inner monologue. At first, he thought he had imagined it. But as the day progressed, it became clear that the thoughts of everyone around him were no longer private. He could hear them, loud, clear, and uninvited. At first, it had seemed like a gift. He could tell when people were lying, when they were hiding something, when their words didn't match the truth inside them. But what began as a strange advantage quickly became his prison. He couldn't shut it off. It was always there, whispering in his ear, echoing through his thoughts, drowning out his own. In the beginning, he had tried to ignore it, closing his eyes, focusing on his own mind, willing it to quiet down. But that only seemed to make it worse. The louder they spoke, the louder their thoughts became, until Peter found himself trapped inside a chaotic storm of words that never ceased. It wasn't just the thoughts of people he passed on the street or those who spoke to him. It was everyone, everywhere. He knew what his neighbour, a woman named Edith, was thinking as she watered her plants on her porch. He could hear her longing to be somewhere else, her deep-rooted fear of living in the same small town all her life. He knew when the grocery clerk, a quiet young man named John, was wondering how he would pay his rent this month. He heard his parents' constant worry about his health, their love mixed with concern so thick it almost suffocated him. And then there were the strangers. It was almost worse with them. He couldn't even make out their faces, yet their inner voices were clear as day. He knew their thoughts of fear, regret, anger, desire. Every fleeting emotion, every half-formed idea that floated through their heads was like a song playing on repeat in his mind. He never asked for any of it. Peter had learned to navigate the world in this new way. He wore headphones constantly to drown out the worst of it, but the thoughts never truly stopped. There was no escape. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, shifting, always shifting, like a tide that could sweep him under at any moment. It became too much. When he tried to talk about it, people would look at him with pity. "It's a gift, Peter," they would say, their voices dripping with that careful sympathy reserved for those they didn't understand. But they didn't know. They couldn't possibly know. How could anyone understand the kind of madness that came with knowing everything? And yet nothing. How could they understand that he longed for silence, true silence, where his own thoughts could be his own, untarnished by the minds of others? His closest friend, Claire, had tried to help him. Claire was the only person Peter could trust. She was a kind woman, always patient with him, always understanding, even when he had to explain over and over again why he couldn't go out, why he couldn't attend social gatherings, or why he sometimes had to run from conversations that threatened to overwhelm him. She was there for him always. But even Claire didn't fully comprehend. How could she? She didn't hear the cacophony inside his head. She didn't live with the noise. Here you go. Peter's apartment was small and cluttered, papers stacked high on every surface, cups of cold coffee, half-finished books and articles. He no longer cared about tidiness. There was no room for neatness in his world. The noise in his mind was a living thing, and it lived with him in every corner. His once well-organized life had been slowly dismantled, piece by piece, by the constant hum of voices that he couldn't escape. He had tried everything: therapy, meditation. He even sought out a specialist, a so-called mind expert, who claimed to have the ability to silence such incessant thought streams. But nothing worked. No one could help him. Everyone he met had the same response: "You're not alone, you're just too sensitive." But Peter knew the truth. He was the only one. He was the only person in the world who couldn't turn it off. And now, after all these years, it had come to this. Peter Thornley, a man who could hear the thoughts of the world, could no longer hear his own. The constant tide of noise had swallowed him whole. He stood on the balcony of his apartment, staring out at the sprawling city below. The wind tugged at his jacket as he looked down at the people walking in the streets, each of them oblivious to the storm inside his mind. He could hear their thoughts of regret, of joy, of lust, of fear, but none of them knew the price he paid. They didn't know the curse of hearing it all. Would they understand if he told them? Would they even care? He closed his eyes, pressing his hands against his ears, trying to block out the constant barrage. But it didn't work. It never worked. The noise never stopped. And in that moment, Peter Thornley realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. There never would be. He was trapped in a world of thoughts that weren't his own, and for the first time in a long while, he began to wonder if he would ever find his way out. The unexpected event came on a Wednesday morning, when Peter was doing his usual routine of walking to the corner store for coffee. He'd already filtered out the thoughts of the passing crowd, focusing on the soft buzz of his own steps and the dull hum of the city around him. This was his small sanctuary, just the few minutes it took to buy his coffee. No voices, no thoughts, just the steady pulse of the world. At least that's what it should have been. Peter was halfway across the street when a thought cut through the air like a jagged knife. It was so loud, so clear, that it nearly stopped him in his tracks. It was a woman's voice, desperate and frantic. "Please, someone help me! I'm not crazy, I swear! Please, make it stop!" Peter froze. He looked around, searching for the source. The noise in his head had always been like a background hum, a constant companion. But this was different. This was a clear cry for help, one that he could feel in his bones, something raw and human. He hadn't felt anything like it in years, this feeling of someone reaching out to him. His fingers tingled. The impulse to help, to find out where it was coming from, was immediate. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, scanning the crowd. But everything looked normal. People walked by, heads down, eyes on their phones. The world around him continued on as if nothing had changed. But Peter couldn't shake the voice. "Please, make it stop!" The woman's words echoed in his head. She was still out there, somewhere, and she was just as trapped as he was. He wasn't sure why he hadn't ignored it like he did so many other thoughts. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice, or perhaps the connection he felt with her, someone who might understand what it felt like to be stuck, trapped in a world of constant noise. He had lived with the weight of other people's thoughts for so long that it almost felt natural, but that voice, "Please, make it stop," that felt like something else entirely. He couldn't leave it unanswered. His first instinct was to go back home, close the door, and bury himself in his apartment where he could escape. But the thought of that woman, her plea, was like a splinter lodged under his skin. It wouldn't go away. "Here you go." He started walking, scanning the streets as he moved. The city was as busy as always, but something felt different now. The noise in his head wasn't just the hum of thoughts he was used to hearing. There was a thread that connected them all, like a single voice rising above the rest. He could hear her now, faint but insistent. "Please, someone, anyone, help me. Why is it always like this?" His heart raced as he followed the sound, his pace quickening. He passed people on the sidewalk, each of them lost in their own world. But Peter wasn't looking at them anymore. He wasn't listening to their idle chatter. He was listening for that one voice. He turned down an alley, where the city's clamour quieted just enough for him to hear the woman more clearly now. The thought was sharp, fragmented, but unmistakable. "I'm not like them. I can't. It's too much, please." There she was. Not in the physical sense, he couldn't see her, but her voice, her thoughts were louder now. Peter slowed to a stop, standing at the edge of the alley, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. He hadn't been this close to someone like this in years. His own mind was a whirlwind, every thought feeling tangled, every voice mixing into one chaotic clamour. Yet this woman, this stranger, had pierced through it all. There was something about her that pulled him in, something familiar in her desperation, something he could no longer ignore. Why does it keep happening? I can't take it anymore. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, but it was impossible. She was so close now, so close that he could feel the weight of her fear pressing against his own mind. It was too much. And then, just as he thought he might break, the world around him shifted. He stumbled back, suddenly overwhelmed by a new presence, something so powerful that it nearly knocked the breath out of him, a new mind, a mind just as sharp, just as present as his own. And this one, it was speaking to him. "I know you can hear me," it whispered, not through words, but through a cold, undeniable thought. "I know what you are, and I can make it stop." Peter's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, looking for the source of the voice. It was different now, no longer the distant cry of the woman, but a new, commanding thought, one that was more deliberate. And it was directed at him. There was no one around him, no one who could have spoken those words aloud, yet he felt them clear as day, like the voice was wrapped around his very mind. Peter felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Who was this? How did they know what he was going through? And what did they mean by making it stop? He wasn't sure if he wanted to find out, but the voice was insistent now, pushing into his thoughts, carving out space for itself. The more he tried to ignore it, the louder it became. "You can't hide from me. I know what you are, and I can help you, if you help me." Peter's pulse quickened. His breath came faster. It was almost unbearable, the tension, the pressure building inside his mind. There was no escape, no way to retreat into silence anymore. It was as if someone had found the key to his torment and was now threatening to unlock the door. He felt like he was drowning in the noise. Desperation gripped him. He needed to understand. He needed answers. His feet moved of their own accord. Without thinking, he started walking again, the voice still echoing in his head, pulling him forward, urging him on. "I know where you're going. I know what you're thinking. I can make this stop." Peter didn't know whether to be terrified or relieved, but in that moment, one thing became clear. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Something was happening. Something he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, Peter wasn't alone in this fight, and he had no idea what he was about to face. Here it is. Peter's feet carried him faster than he'd intended, guided by a force he could neither understand nor control. The voice still echoed in his mind, insistent, filled with an energy he hadn't known in years. It wasn't the chaotic rush of countless strangers' thoughts. It was sharp, focused, and directed only at him. "You can't run from me. You won't escape." The thought felt like a command, not a suggestion. Peter's chest tightened as the words reverberated inside his head, but he couldn't stop. It wasn't even about choice anymore. He had to follow, or the pressure would crack him wide open. His mind raced. Who was this? What did they want from him? But the more he tried to stop, the stronger the pull became. He turned another corner, feeling the city wrap around him, the dense crowd moving like a steady river. The hum of the urban landscape was overwhelming, but the voice, "I know you're listening," was louder than everything else. It wasn't just in his mind now, it was inside him, inescapable. Then, just as he reached the crowded square, something shifted in the air. A sound, a low, rhythmic thrum, like a pulse beneath the pavement. His heart skipped a beat. Peter's instinct screamed for him to stop, but his legs didn't obey. He pushed forward toward the source of that strange noise, but the moment his foot crossed the threshold into the open space, the crowd began to thin out. The people didn't vanish, but something about them changed. They moved sluggishly, their movements unnatural, as though each step took an immense effort. Their faces, once normal, had transformed, blank, absent. Their eyes were hollow, staring ahead without recognition. And worse, Peter could hear it now, their thoughts distorted, muffled like they were speaking underwater. Something was wrong, something far beyond the noise in his own mind. "Do you feel it now?" the voice whispered, smoother, more controlled. "The world around you? Is it all starting to crumble?" Peter's legs froze. He could feel it. The edges of reality themselves were warping. It was as though the thoughts of the people around him weren't just in his head. They were pulling the very fabric of the world apart. This wasn't just a mental attack. It was a physical one. A force greater than anything he had ever encountered. "You can't hide," the voice repeated, now growing darker, a coldness in its command. "I know what you are. I know your weakness." Peter's pulse thundered in his ears. There was no way out of this. He couldn't fight this force, this presence. It was too strong. But just as the pressure built to its peak, a figure emerged from the crowd. A woman. She was unremarkable at first glance. Ordinary clothes, dishevelled hair, eyes wide in fear. But it was her presence that struck Peter like a punch to the gut. She was looking directly at him, her face pale and desperate, as if she were waiting for something. For him. Without thinking, Peter pushed through the frozen crowd, reaching for the woman. She stepped back, shaking her head violently, eyes pleading. Please don't come any closer!" Peter stopped, confusion flooding his mind. The voice in his head had faded for a moment, but the woman's panic was unmistakable. She was trying to tell him something important, something that could explain everything. But she wasn't just speaking to him. She was thinking it too. "You don't know what you're getting into. If you stay, if you listen to them, it'll be worse than you think." Peter's heart beat faster, not just from fear, but from something else. There was a connection. She wasn't just reacting to the chaos around them. She knew what was happening. She was hearing it too. His voice cracked as he forced out the only words he could manage. "Who are you?" The woman's eyes darted around nervously, but then her gaze softened as if she was unsure whether to trust him. "My name's Eva, and I know what this is. I know what's happening to you." Peter's stomach dropped. This was the moment he had feared. For years he had been alone in this madness. And now here was someone else who shared his curse. "You can hear them too, can't you?" Eva whispered. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd that still seemed locked in their trance. "But you can't stop it. Not until you understand." "Here it is." Before Peter could respond, the voice erupted again. "You're wasting time. She can't help you." Eva flinched, and Peter could see the tension in her shoulders. She knew it too. The voice, it was alive. It was real. Peter grabbed her arm, pulling her into a narrow alley where the noise was slightly more bearable. "Tell me what's going on. What is this? What's happening to all these people?" Eva's face tightened with a mix of sorrow and fear. "It's not just the people, it's the world. The more you listen to them, the more you're tied to this place." Peter felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. "Tied to it? What does that mean?" Eva looked around, checking for anyone who might be listening, then lowered her voice. "They know. The ones who speak to you, they know you can hear them. They've been looking for someone like you, someone who can hear their thoughts, someone who can be used to bring the world down." The air around them seemed to thicken. Peter tried to swallow the lump in his throat, but couldn't. His thoughts were a tangle of panic, confusion, and disbelief. He had thought this curse was his own personal nightmare, something that only affected him. But now there were others involved, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. He turned toward Eva, desperate for answers. "So what do we do now?" Eva took a long breath, her hands trembling. "We have to find the source, the one who controls it. We have to stop them before they can tear everything apart." But as she spoke, Peter felt it again. The pressure, the command, louder this time, like it was closing in around him. The voice wasn't just trying to control his mind, it was trying to control everything. "You can't stop it," it said, icy and calm. "This world is mine, and now, so are you." The ground beneath them trembled, and Peter's thoughts spiraled. The world was slipping, the noise was growing again, and this time it wasn't just in his head. Eva was right. They were running out of time. The tension was unbearable. Peter stood in the narrow alley, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths as the force of the voice grew stronger. His thoughts were spiraling, a chaotic blur of disjointed images and voices, each one louder than the last. He could hear Eva's voice, distant and shaky, trying to comfort him, but it was lost beneath the overwhelming weight of the force that now controlled everything. "You can't stop it," the voice whispered, its tone cold and calculating. "You belong to me now, just like everyone else." Peter gripped his head as if trying to hold his skull together, the pressure of the thoughts pushing against his mind like an unrelenting tide. His knees threatened to buckle beneath him. He had been alone in this madness for so long, but now it wasn't just in his head, it was in everything. The world was fraying at the edges, and the very fabric of reality was being shredded by the force of the voice. The woman Eva was still standing there, her hands trembling as she watched him struggle. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Peter!" she cried, her voice breaking through the storm of thoughts for just a moment. "We have to act! We can't let it control you!" Peter's mind raced. He had thought he was the only one affected by the constant noise in his head. But Eva was right. He wasn't alone. She could hear it too. And now they were both caught in a web of unimaginable power. The voice wasn't just controlling his thoughts, it was controlling reality itself. Every breath he took felt like a betrayal. Every heartbeat a rebellion against the force that was tightening around him. "I told you," the voice hummed, growing even more insistent. "You cannot escape me." Peter's body shook with the effort to resist, but his hands were numb, his thoughts slipping further away with each passing second. The world around him blurred, the faces of the people in the streets fading into a smear of colours and sounds. Here it is. But there was one thought, one memory that refused to fade, a whisper of something Eva had said earlier. "We have to find the source." Peter blinked rapidly, focusing through the haze of noise. He could feel the pressure building, the voice's control tightening around him, but he held on to that one word: source. What if the only way to stop this, to stop the voice, was to find where it began, to sever the connection that was holding them all in its grip? "The source," he muttered aloud, though the words felt hollow, lost in the storm of thoughts around him. Eva's eyes widened as she heard it, as though the idea had finally clicked for her too. "We need to find it," she said, urgency in her voice. "The one controlling it, the one behind it all. If we don't, it'll consume everything. It'll break the world down completely." Peter felt the ground shake beneath his feet. The force of the voice was pushing, pulling, tearing at the very foundation of reality. But Eva's words gave him something to hold on to, a thread, however fragile, that he could follow. The source was their only hope. He looked at her, desperation in his eyes. "Where do we go?" His voice was strained, barely audible over the chaos. Eva didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. "Follow me. I know where it is." And they ran. The city around them was warping with each step they took, as though reality itself was being rewritten by the force of the voice. People were moving in slow motion, their minds overtaken by the invisible power that stretched its tendrils through every corner of the world. Buildings seemed to ripple in the distance, their structures bending and distorting. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. "You can't run from me," the voice taunted, its presence growing stronger, more tangible. "You cannot escape. You belong to me." Peter's heart hammered in his chest, the pressure of the voice pushing him forward, urging him to surrender. It was like a claw wrapped around his mind, pulling him toward an inevitable end. But Eva was still pulling him, dragging him through the city with a determination that matched his own. They rounded a corner, and the source of the voice became clear. It was a towering structure, a building unlike any other in the city. It stood at the very edge of the world, its dark silhouette cutting through the sky like a jagged shard. There were no windows, no doors, just a massive black obelisk pulsating with a strange energy. The air around it hummed, vibrating with the force of the voice that had plagued them both. It was the epicenter, the source. Peter's mind screamed at him to turn away. The voice was too powerful now. It was everywhere, inside his mind, inside the world itself. It was pushing him to his knees, to give up, to surrender. But Eva didn't falter. She stepped forward, and Peter, desperate and determined, followed. As they approached the building, a strange sensation washed over him. The ground beneath his feet shifted, the air thickening with static. The noise in his head was deafening, and the voice echoed louder than ever. "You can't stop this," it said, its tone no longer cold but desperate. "You are nothing. I will break you." Peter's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of the words, but he refused to let it break him. Eva was right. They had to reach the source, had to shut it down. He had lived in the silence of his own mind for so long that the thought of it being consumed, of the world being consumed, was unbearable. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingertips brushing the surface of the building. The moment he touched it, the world around him exploded in a cacophony of sound, a blast of thoughts from every direction. But there was something else too, a faint pulse, a rhythm, beating in time with his heart. Eva grabbed his hand, her grip firm. "Together," she whispered. Peter closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt something other than the relentless tide of voices. A strange calm. He focused on the pulse, on the rhythm. There was a connection there, something he could control. And with that connection, he reached into the heart of the building, into the very source of the power, and ripped it out. Here it is. The world shuddered and the voice screamed one last desperate wail before it was silenced. For the first time in years, Peter was free. The world had changed in an instant, and now in the aftermath, the stillness felt almost unreal. Peter stood in the heart of the silent city, his pulse still racing as the weight of the final act slowly settled over him. The constant bombardment of voices was gone, leaving only the faint echo of his breath in the air. Eva stood beside him, her eyes wide with the same disbelief that he felt. Her grip on his hand was still tight, and her gaze darted over the now quiet streets, taking in the aftermath of their struggle. The world felt both unnervingly still and achingly fragile. "We did it," she whispered, as if speaking aloud might make it more real. The force that had torn apart their lives, the relentless noise that had trapped them for so long, had finally been silenced. But with it came a wave of new emotions: grief, relief, and the deep, unsettling question of what came next. Peter didn't know what to say. He was still reeling from the act of severing the connection. The moment when he had reached into the heart of the building and ripped the source from its grip on reality. He had no idea what he had unleashed, but the fact that the noise was gone was enough to leave him breathless with both triumph and trepidation. As the silence stretched between them, Eva broke it again. "Where do we go from here?" Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as if she too was unsure of what the future held now that the battle was over. Peter glanced around, his mind still trying to piece together the fractured reality they were now facing. The city, once a chaotic jumble of distorted sights and sounds, was now still, almost unnervingly so. The buildings stood as silent sentinels, their sharp edges cutting through the sky in perfect, unyielding symmetry. The people who had once been lost in their own minds, like him, were now frozen in place. Some stood motionless in the streets, others sat in their homes with blank, empty expressions. The world felt empty, hollow, as if something essential had been ripped away along with the voices. And yet, there was a strange peace in the silence. Peter's gaze shifted to Eva, and he saw the same confusion mirrored in her face. "We rebuild," he said, his voice thick with the weight of uncertainty. "We rebuild the world, Eva, but we have to start somewhere." Eva nodded, her face pale but determined. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the streets around them. "We need to find the others. They need to understand what happened, what we did. Maybe then they'll be able to understand themselves again." Peter turned to her, his heart heavy with the thought of those they had left behind, the people who had lived under the shadow of the same voice for so long. How could they help them now? How could they explain the power they had just unleashed? But Eva's words gave him hope. They couldn't just leave it all behind, not when the world still felt so fragile, so on the brink of falling apart. "We'll find them," Peter said, his voice firm. "But we have to be careful. We can't let anyone fall back into the same trap. We have to teach them how to live without the voice, how to think for themselves again." Eva met his gaze, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "And what about you, Peter? What about us?" He paused, taking a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to think about the future, about what came after the silence. There was no easy answer, no simple road ahead. But one thing was clear. They had both changed. They were no longer the people they had been before the voice, before the source had been torn from the world. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softer now, tinged with the uncertainty that still gnawed at him. "I don't know what's next for us, but I do know this. We're in this together. We'll figure it out." Eva's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile, and she squeezed his hand tighter. Together, we always will be. Here it is. As they stood there, in the heart of the city that had once been a place of madness and confusion, Peter realized that this was just the beginning. They had faced the worst of it, the battle to silence the voices, the struggle to free themselves from the grip of an unimaginable power. But now they had to face something equally as daunting, the task of rebuilding the world, piece by piece, person by person. They couldn't undo the damage that had been done, couldn't erase the scars left by the force that had consumed their lives for so long. But they could create something new, something that wasn't shaped by the chaos of the voice. They could build a world where silence was not a prison, but a space for creation. A world where people could learn to think for themselves again, to connect with each other in ways that had once been lost. Peter glanced around, taking in the sights of the city, now eerily still. It was both a reflection of the devastation they had overcome and a canvas for what was to come. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing at the edge of something both terrifying and exhilarating. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady now. "We have work to do." Eva nodded, and together they started walking through the streets, toward the unknown. The weight of their journey, the uncertainty of the future, still pressed down on them, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Now it was a challenge they would face side by side. As they moved forward, they found others, people who had been lost in the silence of their minds, now emerging from the haze, struggling to remember who they had been before the voices. Peter and Eva spoke to them, shared their story, and helped them begin to understand what had happened. Slowly, the world began to take shape again. The people who had been affected by the voices started to rebuild their lives, one small step at a time. The silence, once terrifying, was now a symbol of freedom. It was no longer something to fear, but something to cherish. And in that silence, Peter and Eva found a new kind of peace. A peace built on the understanding that, together, they could face whatever came next. For the first time in years, Peter felt as though he could breathe. The voices were gone. The source was destroyed, and the world was theirs to rebuild. The city, once a cacophony of endless voices, was finally still. The frantic whispers and clamoring thoughts had faded into silence, leaving an unsettling calm in their wake. Peter and Eva stood side by side on the balcony of the building they had once fought to escape. Below, the world stretched out before them, empty streets, deserted homes, and the faint hum of life that had been drowned out for so long. Now, it was all theirs to rebuild. But would they be able to? Would they even know where to start? Peter glanced at Eva. Her eyes were far away, tracing the skyline, the uncertainty of their future reflected in her gaze. The silence had done more than free them from the grip of the voices. It had left them with a gaping hole, a quiet that was both soothing and eerie. The world felt fragile, like it might crumble if they did not tread carefully. "Eva!" Peter's voice broke the silence between them, soft but filled with urgency. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. His heart had been heavy ever since they had severed the connection, unsure if they had done the right thing or if they had caused irreparable damage. "Do you think we've done the right thing?" She turned to him, her brow furrowed, as if she had been lost in her own thoughts. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice carrying a weight that mirrored his. "But we had to do something. The voices, everything was spinning out of control. I think we've given them a chance to find themselves again." Peter nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words settle in his chest. It had been a desperate act, but it was the only one they could take. The voices had been a force that controlled everyone, twisted their thoughts and actions, and now, without it, they were free. But freedom had come at a cost. It was one thing to silence the source, but another to deal with what came after, the uncertainty, the grief, the emptiness. "Here it is. There's so much to do," Eva continued, breaking through his thoughts. "We have to help them rebuild. We have to teach them how to live without it." Peter looked out over the city, feeling the weight of her words. The people who had been under the influence of the voice for so long were still in shock, their lives turned upside down by the sudden shift in reality. Some had begun to stir, waking from the fog that had clouded their minds for years. Others remained still, trapped in their confusion, unsure of how to proceed. "Where do we start?" Peter asked, the question more for himself than for Eva. The weight of responsibility was heavier than anything he had ever known. Eva took a deep breath, her eyes bright with determination. "We start with them," she said, her gaze sweeping over the city. "We find the ones who are lost, who can't hear their own thoughts anymore. We help them." Peter felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could do this. Maybe they could help the world heal from the damage they had all endured. But even as the thought crossed his mind, another voice, small but insistent, echoed in the back of his mind. Could they really fix it? Could they truly rebuild what had been broken for so long? "I don't know if we can do it alone," Peter admitted, his voice quiet. "We don't have to do it alone," Eva replied, squeezing his hand. "We'll do it together. We've already taken the hardest step. Now we just have to help the others take theirs." Peter looked at her, her words sinking in. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the people they had left behind, the ones who needed help finding their way again. They had taken the voices away, but that didn't mean everything would magically fall into place. The world was a mess, and they had only begun to understand the full extent of the damage. But the silence, strange as it was also an opportunity, a chance to create something new. As they descended into the streets, they found the city a strange, haunted place. The buildings stood like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the empty roads. People were emerging from their homes, blinking in the harsh light of the new world they had been thrust into. Some wandered aimlessly, others sat on the steps of their houses, staring off into the distance, lost in thought. There was no rush, no urgency. For the first time in years, there was no noise, no pressure. Peter and Eva made their way through the streets, speaking softly to those they encountered, offering help and guidance. They taught the people how to trust their own minds again, how to listen to their own voices. It wasn't easy, and there were many setbacks, but slowly, day by day, they saw change. People started to remember who they were, what they loved, what they had once believed in before the voices had consumed them. They helped them reclaim their identities, their dreams, their thoughts. Weeks passed, and the city began to breathe again. The silence had not been an end, but a beginning. The people, though still uncertain, started to rebuild their lives. They formed new connections, made new choices. Peter and Eva watched as the world began to shift, the heavy burden of the voices finally lifting from the shoulders of those who had once been trapped in its grip. One evening, as they sat on the roof of their building, watching the sunset, Peter turned to Eva, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. "We did it," he said softly. "We gave them the chance to find their own way, and they're doing it." Eva smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face. "We did it together." Peter nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. There was still so much to be done, but for the first time in a long while he felt a sense of hope. The world was still uncertain, still fragile, but it was no longer a world defined by fear, by the constant pressure of the voices. It was a world full of potential, full of possibility. And for Peter, that was enough. As the stars began to twinkle above, he realized that they had not only silenced the voices, they had given the world back its freedom, its silence. And in that silence, they had found the space to heal, to grow, and to live again. The lesson was clear. True freedom came not from the absence of noise, but from the power to choose. Choosing who you would become, what you would believe, and how you would live. And with that knowledge, Peter and Eva knew that they had not only saved themselves, but they had given the world the most precious gift of all, the chance to live without fear, to think without interference, to be truly free.